So my name is Jaylene Molina, and I'm an ESG consultant for Envision Blockchain. We also have Max Pinola here today. He's our ESG lead. This webinar will provide an overview of two methodologies, one being VAERS Afforestation, Reforestation, and Revegetation Methodology, and the other is Gold Standard Afforestation and Reforestation Methodology. We'll also be introducing you to the Guardian and our policy differentiation tool. So please save your questions for the end of the webinar and we'll allocate some time to answer those. So let's begin. So there are a lot of new people in the crowd today, and some have been here before and probably already know about Envision Blockchain and what we do. But if you are new, let me give you a brief introduction. Envision Blockchain Solutions offers expertise in the Web3 space, specifically in building and maintaining applications that help organizations navigate their Web3 journey, with our specialized focus on guiding organizations through the three major milestones of use case analysis, proof of concept development, and scaled deployments. We're uniquely positioned to help our clients achieve their Web3 goals. And with our expertise as the builders and maintainers of the Guardian, we offer insights and support to ensure that our clients stay ahead of the curve in this fast-moving and dynamic space. As you may know, the process of designing and collecting the supporting data for carbon claims is heavily manual and prone to errors. This can be due to a lack of poor quality, a lack of assurance, potential double counting, greenwashing, and an overall lack of trust. The Guardian is here to address these issues head on by leveraging a cutting-edge policy workflow engine. The Guardian can mirror the standards and business requirements of regulatory bodies, creating extremely flexible digital methodologies known as DMRV. This approach not only helps organizations ensure compliance with regulatory requirements, but it also enables them to streamline their carbon accounting processes, improve data quality, and reduce the risk of errors and inaccuracies. So you could think of a policy inside the Guardian as a digital version of a methodology. And by using the policy workflow blocks like Legos, you could design a desired workflow. Overall, the Guardian represents a major step forward in the area of carbon markets. It empowers organizations to take bold actions on climate change with confidence and credibility, ensuring that they could drive meaningful progress towards a more sustainable future. At the heart of this ecosystem are four key technologies that enable us to deliver trusted and transparent solutions for the carbon market. First, we use W3C decentralized identifiers known as DIDs. DIDs are globally unique identifiers that allow individuals and organizations to generate their own identifiers using systems they trust. By using DIDs, we can ensure that carbon credits are issued to the correct party and that they cannot be duplicated or manipulated in any way. Second, we use W3C verifiable credentials. VCs are digital documents that provide information related to the subject, the issuing authority, the type of credential, specific attributes of the subject, and evidence related to how the credential was derived. By using VCs, we can ensure that carbon credits are issued only to those who meet the necessary criteria and that the credits themselves are valid and trustworthy. We also use W3C verifiable presentations, VPs, and VPs are a collection of one or more VCs. Finally, we use public ledger technology and a public workflow engine. Our PWE uses fully configurable and human-readable logic blocks that are accessible through either a user interface or an application programming interface that you may know as an API. This enables us to create highly customizable solutions that are tailored to meet the specific needs of each individual organization. By leveraging these technologies, we could deliver trusted, transparent, and customizable solutions. To the right, we can see an example of our trust chain, and one of the key benefits of the Guardian solution is our trust chain, which is a crucial component of our fully auditable ecosystem. The trust chain allows us to track who did what from the very beginning of the workflow to the very end. This is essential for maintaining transparency and trust in the carbon market. And by using the trust chain, we can create a VC file that contains all the information that was input by different roles throughout the workflow. This information includes project details, issuance of carbon credits, and verification of those credits. This VC file is then stored on a public ledger, which allows for complete transparency and verification of the entire process. So a little background information on our Guardian releases. The initial release was in October of 2021, which included the front end and back end service with token functions and storage, message broker, IoT simulator, and a policy workflow engine. The subsequent releases have added API stability, versioning and publishing, and importing of policies. Later releases added support for complex policy workflow blocks like calculation and aggregation, enhanced usage of VCs and VPs, event-driven workflows, dry run for operations, multi-user roles, and multi-signature approvals. And the latest version was released in March of 2023, which added support for retirement, multi-policy tokens, disaster recovery, the policy differentiation tool, enhanced policy creation, as well as improved production readiness. We currently have two versions of Guardian available. We have open source Guardian that's available to fork and use immediately. You can find that on our GitHub. And we have Managed Guardian Service that's in a live free beta period. We'll be doing a demo using Managed Guardian Service towards the end of this webinar. So now that we have discussed Guardian and its benefits, let's go over how we develop policies based on a methodology. Developing policies is a crucial step in implementing any methodology, as it ensures that the intended outcomes are achieved and sustained over time. We developed a checklist that can break down each step that is taken from the very beginning all the way to when you build a policy for Guardian. So let's walk through these. Step one is to find out what type of credit you'll need. Is it a VCU, which is a verified carbon unit, a VER, a voluntary emission reduction, could be a REC, which is a renewable energy certificate, or any other that's currently available. Once you know the credit you want to receive, then step two will be much easier, or vice versa. Finding the appropriate standard body is heavily dependent on the type of credit you choose. So for example, if you want a VCU, you'll have to use Verra, or if you know that you're going to be using Verra as your standard body, then the type of credit you'll be receiving is a VCU. Step three is to look through the registry's website and look for their list of methodologies. To the right, we could see a list for Verra. This is a great example of what you'll see when you search for a methodology. And then to the far right is CDM's different tabs where you'd click on methodologies and see their list. You want to choose a methodology that best aligns with your project, especially because these methodologies can be extremely specific. Moving on to step four, this is when you'll open up that methodology and familiarize yourself with their applicability, the parameters you'll need to source data for, etc. And now you're ready to start a spreadsheet and create your schemas. You're going to want to keep an eye out for external tools you'll need to reference. For example, there could be a CDM tool that is required in order to calculate a certain parameter, but this will be mentioned within the methodology document. Next is creating a workflow, which will help you understand the steps that need to be taken by the different roles involved in the project. So you'll be answering things like who, what, and when. And lastly is building a policy for the Guardian. In today's webinar, we have an exciting agenda planned for you. We'll kick things off with a concise recap of our previous methodology breakdown webinars, which included two Verra methodologies, VM17, Adoption of Sustainable Agricultural Land Management, and VM42, which was Methodology for Improved Agricultural Land Management. For those who missed it, we also created a dedicated YouTube video that delves into these methodologies. Following this, we'll introduce you to VAERS methodology for afforestation, reforestation, and revegetation, along with their methods for calculating emissions and reductions. We'll do an overview of Gold Standard's methodology for afforestation and reforestation and provide you with valuable insights into their approach. Next, we'll introduce you to our policy differentiation tool, which is available exclusively on The Guardian. This powerful tool is specifically designed to help you gain a comprehensive understanding of the methodologies, their similarities and differences, allowing you to make informed policy decisions that align with your goals. Following that, we'll conduct an in-depth comparison and scoring of Verra's AR methodology versus Gold Standard's AR methodology, giving you a better understanding of which approach may be most suitable for your needs. Finally, we'll wrap up the webinar by demonstrating our Managed Guardian service and showcasing how it can be used to develop policies and mint tokens. So before we dive into the details of today's presentation, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge our previous webinars. In these webinars, we covered Verra's methodology for the adoption of sustainable agricultural land management and Verra's methodology for improved agricultural land management. These webinars provided insights into the challenges being faced by the agricultural industry and how digital methodologies on The Guardian can help organizations create trustworthy policies. We explored the methodologies in depth, discussing their key features and benefits, and providing practical examples of how we create our schemas and our policies. In today's webinar, we'll compare the Verra and Gold Standard methodology that will be focusing on afforestation and reforestation. And by using our policy differentiation tool, we'll highlight the key differences in their workflows and schemas. So now I'll be handing the mic over to Max Pinola, our ESG lead.
Thanks, Jaylene. So before we dive into the Verra AR methodology, it's important to note that this methodology is still under development, but it basically entails two different approaches: the area-based approach, which scales estimates of biomass per hectare to the project level using an area multiplier, and the census-based, which scales biomass per tree to the project level using a complete census of all planted trees. In this case, we'll be focusing on the area-based approach. In this approach, the baseline scenario calculates estimated vegetative stocking over 5 years in control plots that are monitored outside of the project area. Increase in EVS is used to calculate a performance benchmark percentage to be deducted from the GHG removals of the project. The performance benchmark will also be used to demonstrate additionality. The project scenario calculates carbon stock in each year for each carbon pool in tons of carbon per hectare, and that's used to calculate average annual change in carbon stock. Emissions from biomass burning are calculated with area burnt times biomass stock before burning, and emissions from fertilizers is calculated based on the area applied, the mass of the fertilizer, and the N content of the fertilizer, and various defaults. Leakage is accounted for using relative productivity, which is calculated for each agricultural commodity, calculated as the project area productivity divided by national productivity. And this is used to calculate a standardized leakage discount factor. Then uncertainty is accounted for through field measurements. A 95% confidence interval is calculated. The percentage of uncertainty for each pool is calculated as the 95% confidence interval as a percentage of the mean. Then a final percentage uncertainty and net GHG removal estimates are used to calculate the final uncertainty deduction. Here we have the final calculation in the methodology, which is used to calculate how many credits will be issued, which is basically the net GHG removals due to project activity up to year T, which is the end of the monitoring period, with the performance benchmark, leakage discount factor, and uncertainty deducted. So a general approach to digitizing schemas is to start with this final equation and then work backwards through each equation in the methodology until you arrive at the monitored input parameters. Then all equations are built into the schema to auto-calculate net GHG removals and token issuance for monitored inputs and defaults. This streamlines calculations and helps ensure that GHG removals and token issuance are calculated correctly. And it also helps project proponents focus their efforts on the monitored parameters. So the main schema input parameters for the project scenario: carbon stock for each biomass pool, the area burnt, the area on which fertilizer was applied, the mass of the fertilizer, and the N content of the fertilizer. For the baseline scenario, the main inputs are estimated vegetative stocking, and for leakage is the project area agricultural productivity. The carbon pools accounted for in the project boundary include above ground woody, above ground non-woody, below ground woody, and below ground non-woody biomass. Optional pools, which are not included in this schema, are deadwood, litter, soil organic carbon, and harvested wood products. GHG sources in the project boundary include burning of tree biomass, carbon, methane, and nitrous oxide, emissions from nitrogen fertilizer, nitrous oxide, and not included are burning of biomass fuels, which are considered de minimis. So now we can take a deeper look into the Excel of the schema. At the top, we have the project details. A little below that, we have default values such as global warming potentials, emissions factors, and root to chute ratio. In the baseline, you'll see the inputs of EVSs of the control plots. Increases in EVS and the performance benchmark are auto-calculated. All the green cells that you see are auto-calculated, and the equations are built into the schema. Under the project scenario, under the carbon pools, you'll see the main inputs being the carbon stock in tons of carbon per hectare. Everything else is auto-calculated, and this is done for each year. For emissions of biomass burning, the inputs are the area burnt for each year and everything else being auto-calculated. And emissions from fertilizer, we have the area on which fertilizer is applied, the mass, the N content, and everything else being auto-calculated. Finally, at the bottom, the net GHG removals due to project activity up to year T, the end of the monitoring period. We have the emissions and removals for each year totaled, uncertainty, the standard leakage, discount factor, etc., and net GHG removals are auto-calculated with that final equation at the bottom being the one against which tokens are minted. So here we have the Guardian policy workflow using a digitized version of VAERS verified carbon standards processes, roles, and actions involved in the validation of projects, the verification of G removals, and the issuance of credits. The roles, if you see at the bottom left, are color-coded, the blue being the project proponent, orange being Verra, and the green being the VB. So the workflow goes as such. The project proponent prepares and documents and submits the project description to Verra. Verra adds the project to the project pipeline, submits project docs to Verra project registry, and then the VB assesses and validates the project description, provides a validation report. Then the project proponent conducts the monitoring and sends a monitoring report to the VB, and the VB then reviews and delivers a verification report, verification representation, and verification statement. Verra reviews the VCU issuance request, and then finally Verra deposits VCUs in the account and records it on the registry.
All right, now we can go into an introduction and overview of Gold Standard and their AR methodology. So for this methodology, the baseline scenario is established by accounting for both tree and non-tree biomass on the land prior to the project. There are IPCC default values that can be used for vegetation types where specific information is not available. The project scenario evaluates the change in tree volume throughout the duration of the project. So during each monitoring period, the parameter for tree volume will be updated appropriately. When it comes to emissions, GHG emissions from biomass burning for site preparation and nitrogen fertilizer are accounted for in year one. So we would not have to update the emission parameters for every monitoring report since they're all estimated and deducted in the first year. Leakage is calculated by estimating the biomass impacts of leakage for collection of wood, timber harvesting, agriculture, and livestock. But if none of these apply to your project, then there would be no leakage. When calculating uncertainty, Gold Standard has a 90% confidence interval that's applied. If uncertainty is under 20%, then there's no deductions to your verified emission reduction. If there's a 20 to 30% uncertainty, then 50% deduction is applied. If there's a 30 to 40% uncertainty, then 75% deduction is applied. And if you have a 40 to 50% uncertainty, then 100% deduction will be applied. Using the equation provided within the methodology that says that the project CO2 removals are equal to the biomass CO2 removal minus the baseline, minus leakage, and minus other emissions, we then multiply all of that by the eligible planting area, and we can get the net GHG emission reductions and removals. This is all calculated in an Excel spreadsheet because it makes it easier for us to use auto-calculate fields in order to transfer the information into the Guardian. And here we have a list of the main schema input parameters. These are parameters that will have to be updated in the monitoring report that we will take a look at when we do our demo for the Guardian. In the project scenario, we have stem volume and kilograms of nitrogen fertilizer applied. The baseline will have two parameters that are dry biomass and stem volume. And then for leakage, there's a parameter titled leakage displacement. This will be the white fields we'll see in the schemas, and these parameters are then used for auto calculations that will be reflected in green when we look at the schemas. So let's go over the carbon pools associated with this methodology. This image is an example of how the carbon pools can be mentioned within the methodology document. You can see that the first one is tree biomass, and it includes stems, branches, and bark, next to what we see yes for CO2 removals, baseline, and leakage. But in non-tree biomass, we see no for CO2 removal and leakage. So the non-tree biomass will not be included in our calculations for CO2 removal and leakage, but it will be included in the calculation for baseline. Next, we have soil, which is optional in this methodology, but for today's example, we did not include it. And finally, we have harvested wood and litter, which are both not included in this methodology. GHG sources included in this methodology are coming from the burning of tree biomass for site preparation. These emissions are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Then we have nitrous oxide emissions from the use of nitrogen fertilizer. Emissions that are not included are coming from the burning of fossil fuel. So these will not be accounted for in the schemas, and we could take a look at those. The gold standard schema. So at the top, we have our required fields, our schema type, the question, if we're allowing multiple answers, and the answer. And this is also, when we transfer it into the Guardian, we know what type of information we're putting in. Then we have our project details, our default values, and each one of these breaks are going to be what we consider a schema. We have our baseline scenario. We're seeing these white fields that have number under schema type, and we're seeing that parameter or stem volume that will have to be updated in the project scenario. All the greens are auto calculates that are using this field above it. We have our nitrogen fertilizer as the emission, so that is a field that would be updated within Guardian. And leakage, and then we have our annual net average over the crediting period, which is what we're going to mint against. And here we have the gold standard workflow. So for gold standard, we're going to have 5 different roles. We have our project proponent, gold standard as a registry, the validation verification body, NGO supporters, and the technical advisory committee. And if we start to the far left, the project proponent would prepare and document the project description and submit it to Gold Standard. Then Gold Standard would add the project to the project pipeline. The VVB will then assess and validate the project description and provide a validation report. Then Gold Standard will do a project design review and certification. And at this point, the NGO supporters and the technical advisory committee will have those documents made available to them so that they can comment. Then the project proponent will conduct monitoring and send a monitoring report to the VVB. And the VVB will review and deliver a verification report. Gold Standard will do a performance review and certification. And again, the NGO supporters and the technical advisory committee will have those documents available to them where they'll be able to comment. And then Gold Standard will issue the VERs. And these are all steps that we're going to be seeing when we do a demo in Guardian. We'll see the different roles playing each one of these parts. Let's do an introduction of what our policy differentiation tool before we do a demo. So we've developed a feature called policy differentiation that allows users to easily compare policies issued by different or the same standard registries. This differentiation feature evaluates policies based on their blocks, transitions between blocks, roles, actors, and more. The policy differentiation tool displays a numerical compatibility score and a list of differences. The policy differentiation tool is currently in its MVP phase, meaning that it's in its early development, and we plan to add more features to future updates, so we really value the community's input and would appreciate any feedback on what additional features you would like to see added to this tool. Throughout 2023, we'll work closely with the community to further develop these features. We're also building a versatile tagging system within the Guardian that will enable users to create and manage informative tags for various assets and artifacts like policies in the Guardian ecosystem. Combining the policy differentiation tool with tagging allows for independent commentary and review of each methodology. These tags can be added by any actor with a valid decentralized ID, making it a powerful tool similar to Yelp or Amazon reviews for the carbon market industry. And we believe that combining the differentiation feature with the tagging feature will showcase how creating digital methodologies can revolutionize the carbon market industry. This is an example of what we're going to see when we go and use this tool. So this is what the differences could look like. On the left, we have Gold Standard policy, and on the right, we have Verra. So we're seeing some information on the right, and in that description, we have organic nitrogen fertilizer applied in the project scenario in year 2018. But to the left, we're not seeing a comparable field. So this is because in the schemas, we don't have any differentiation between organic or synthetic fertilizer in our Gold Standard schema, where in the Verra schema, we are having that difference and that field exists. But if we have similarities, it would look more like this, where we're seeing green on both sides. We see in the description that they both have project scope, and within these schemas, they both exist, and they both fall under scope 14. So we're seeing a total rate of similarity at 100%. So let's do a quick demo of how this tool works. So when we go into our Manage Guardian service, we see at the top our user profile, tokens tab, of policy, and then we see create new, we see import. So you could import from a file, import from IPFS, or we have open source policies. But we're mainly focusing here in this compare button. So if we click the compare button, we see we can choose our first policy, and we'll choose Gold Standard, which will appear on the left. And then we can choose Verra, that's going to appear on the right. And now we're saying that the policies are 80% the same, but this isn't at the schema level, it's at the workflow level. We'll look at the schema ones next. So again, we have Gold Standard here on the left, and then we have Verra on the right. We have our policy roles. We're seeing 4 roles here, and that's because we're logged in as the standard registry, which would make it 5. So we have our project proponent, our VB, the technical advisory committee and NGO supporters, and the standard registry. And then on Verra's side, we have the project proponent, the VVB, and the standard registry. Then we have policy groups, we have policy topics, and this is where Guardian sends the policy information. So when Guardian publishes a policy, it sends the information to hedera topics, and that's where the information is stored on chain on the hedera network. And we have policy tokens and policy blocks. We see a legend here. So if it's green, blocks are equal, including their child blocks. If it's green and yellow, blocks are equal, but their child blocks are different. If it's yellow, blocks are all of the same type and are partially equal. And then if it's red, blocks are absent in the other policy. These can be switched on and off. So now we can look at some of these. We see choose roles, and this is something we went over. So we have 4 roles here: the project proponent, the VBB, the technical advisory committee, NGO supporters. These 2 are in red because they don't exist in the Verra workflow. And then we're seeing green for project proponent and VBB as they exist in both. And as we go down, we keep seeing all these workflow blocks. This is all the steps that's going to happen within Guardian when you're developing these policies and going through all the processes. A lot of these are going to be very similar since we have only a few differences within the workflow. Here we're seeing a large difference where we have our comment blocks. So within the workflow, we have our NGO supporters and the technical advisory committee that can comment in one of the workflow blocks where that doesn't exist in the Verra workflow. So then if we go back to the top, we have a schemas tab, and this is where we'll be able to compare at a schema level. So we see the compare button again. We can click that. And now we get to choose the policy. So we'll keep Gold Standard on the left and Verra on the right. And then we'll choose our monitoring report. We'll click on the auto. This will give us all the fields that were in our schema, including the auto calculate fields. And then we'll click compare. And now we're seeing at a schema level, there's 61% the same. So we have Gold Standard on the left and Verra on the right. We're seeing lots of green in the beginning, and this is because all the project details are going to be the same for these 2 examples since we use the same information to compare. So we have project scope for both. This is a field that exists within our schemas, and they both fall under scope 14. So that's going to be 100% the same. This is all the other project details and details about the project proponent. Now we're seeing some that aren't here in the Gold Standard one, but they are in the Verra. And this is the estimated vegetative stocking. This is something that exists in the calculations for Verra, but not in the calculations for Gold Standard. And here we have a yellow block. This is our container block for project scenario for nitrogen fertilizer emissions. So they both do take into account nitrogen fertilizer, but in different ways. So we see a lot of blocks here that exist for the Verra one, and these are the organic nitrogen fertilizer. We have the synthetic nitrogen fertilizer calculation, but within Gold Standard, we don't just differentiate organic or synthetic fertilizers. So that's why it's not reflecting here. And if we go all the way down, we can find our net GHG block. So we have our net GHG emission reductions and removals. They're both going to have that field in their schemas, and that's what we are minting against. And now back to Max so we can do an overview of Verra and Gold Standard.
Thanks, Shailene. So now I'll go over some of the key differences between Verra and Gold Standard reforestation methodologies. At the workflow level and process level, one of the key differences that you may have noticed is that there's an additional block for under Gold Standard where the Gold Standard registry is reviewing and deciding upon certification directly when it comes to valid certifying the project design and the performance review, and that's in addition to the VB. Also, under monitoring, Gold Standard requires annual reports in addition to monitoring reports. And Gold Standard also has some additional roles, such as the Technical Advisory Committee and the NGO supporters who will be reviewing and providing comments during the project design and performance reviews. Some key differences when it comes to impact quantification for non-permanent risk and buffer pool. Gold Standard applies a flat 20% deduction for non-permanent risk, where Verra has a very detailed risk rating system, which is used to calculate the percentage to be removed for non-permanent risk and added to the buffer pool. Under uncertainty, Gold Standard uses a 90% confidence interval, while Verra uses a 95% confidence interval, and Gold Standard, anything less than 20%, there's no deduction for uncertainty, where Verra always calculates an uncertainty deduction. For leakage, Gold Standard estimates biomass impacts of leakage, where Verra uses relative agricultural productivity to determine a standard leakage discount factor. For additionality, there's two options under Gold Standard. You can use the CDM tool or a positive list option, while Verra estimates vegetative stocking for control plots using monitoring. Overview, some more impact quantification differences. For the baseline, Gold Standard reprojects biomass and uses defaults, while Verra uses EVS, monitors EVS of control plots and uses that to calculate a performance benchmark to be deducted from the net benefit. And for the project scenario, Gold Standard calculates greenhouse gas emissions from biomass burning, but only for site preparation. And for nitrogen fertilizer application, they use the amount of fertilizer applied and default emissions factors, and they do not differentiate between organic and synthetic fertilizer. Verra calculates greenhouse gas emissions from biomass burning, and they use specific fertilizer applications based on with specific N content and specific mass of organics and synthetic fertilizer. For issuance calculation, Gold Standard deducts all leakage and baseline from year one, where leakage and baseline is deducted up to year X at the end of the monitoring period for Verra. And also Gold Standard requires a minimum of 3 SDGs to have positive impacts on, while Verra focuses on climate. So general overview of our scoring approach, we assessed each methodology based on 10 key factors, which we'll go into on the next slide. Then, using a combination of various approaches, the policy differentiation tool, the schema differentiation tool, and a methodology review, we identified the key differences of these key factors, and then each of the factors were rated on a scale of 1 to 10. The point allocation and rating approach will be refined going forward. Right now, they're not weighted. Each factor has 10 possible points. But going forward, we'll be refining this and eventually be weighting these factors, as some factors will naturally be more important than others. So one thing to keep in mind is that scoring systems can be inherently prone to subjectivity, and assigning points to specific factors can add an additional level of subjectivity. But in general, under workflows and procedures, there's additional reviews and direct certification decisions by Gold Standard and additional policy blocks for that by Gold Standard in addition to the VB. And they also have additional roles, the Technical Advisory Committee and NGO supporters, and they also require annual reporting. So based on those factors, we awarded more points to Gold Standard for workflow and procedures. For risk and buffer pools, Verra has a more detailed process of assessing and rating risk, while Gold Standard uses a flat 20% deduction. For uncertainty, for Gold Standard projects under 20% uncertainty, which will include many projects, no uncertainty deductions will be accounted for. And Gold Standard also uses a lower confidence interval. For leakage, there's different approaches, and it's unclear if one is objectively better than the other. So for leakage, they both received 7s. For additionality, Verra proves additionality based on actual monitored data and control plots, while Gold Standard estimates biomass impacts. So based on the fact that they're actually monitoring instead of using estimates. For baseline emission quantification, Verra quantifies the baseline based on estimated vegetative stocking, actual monitored data, and Gold Standard uses defaults. For the project scenario greenhouse gas quantifications, the approaches are very similar, but Gold Standard calculates emissions from N fertilizers based on the amount of fertilizer and default emissions factors and does not differentiate between organic and synthetic fertilizer, while Verra actually calculates emissions based on specific N content and mass of both organic and synthetic fertilizers. Under issuance calculations, there is a key difference where Gold Standard applies leakage and the baseline all deducted from year 1, and where Verra does it at the end of the monitoring period, applied to all the years, but it's not clear which approach is objectively better than the other. So both receive 7s for that. Under required impact categories, Gold Standard requires 3 SDGs, so they're impacting more categories and will award more points under that factor. For general conservativeness, Verra results in less CRUs despite using the same hypothetical project, and therefore is considered more conservative for this specific context and instance. But keep in mind that conservativeness scores will be project and context specific. So now I'll kick it back over to Jaylene, who's going to demo Guardian policy creation and policy differentiation tool.
All right, so we're going to move into a demo, one for Verra and one for Gold Standard. So we can start with the Gold Standard policy. And based on the workflow that we spoke about in the presentation, we mentioned that for Gold Standard, there's going to be 5 different roles. And by clicking on user, we see that we're currently logged in as the administrator, which is going to be our standard registry. So in order to add 4 more roles, we're going to click create user. Each time that you click it, you'll be creating a new user. And now we can see that here. So we have user 1, 2, 3, and 4, and our administrator, which is our standard registry. So now let's click on user 1. And now we see that we could choose a role. So we're going to assign project proponent to user 1. Then we're going to go to user 2 and assign the VVB. So now the VVB would be able to enter their information. For this demo, we're just going to name them VVB. And you see it says waiting for approval. So this is the part in the workflow where we would go back to the standard registry and the standard registry has to approve the VVB, but we're going to continue assigning these roles and then we'll get back to that. So the next role is going to be the Technical Advisory Committee, which is a role that we have in the Gold Standard workflow, but it's not in a Verra workflow. And the last one's going to be NGO supporters. This is the same thing where we have that in the Gold Standard workflow, but not in the Verra workflow. So now going back to the standard registry, This is where the standard registry now has access to all the information about the VBB in this VC file, and then they're able to approve or reject. So we're going to select approve. And looking here at the top, we have approved VBB, project pipeline, monitoring reports, token history, and trust chain. As we move through this workflow, we're going to go into each one of these tabs. So our next step here is going to the project proponent, and the project proponent now creates their project. So by clicking on this new project button, we get all the schemas that we listed as required in our Excel. So the summary of the project description, and for this demo, we're just going to use X's as the text fields. And when we get to the number fields, we'll just have some demo values. So it's not associated to any particular project. So we're seeing the first schema of the project detail, the project proponent information. You can include a map here of the project area. Now some more information about the project area, the length of the monitoring, what are your carbon pools, your GHG sources, and what monitoring plan are you using. Now we're going into the default values. And as mentioned, when we took a look at the Excel spreadsheet, which had our schemas, we spoke about how all those white fields that are listed as a number are going to be used when we auto calculate. And all those auto calculations are coming from the equations that were listed out in the methodology. So now we have our project scenario, which is our nitrogen fertilizer. This is going to calculate all the emissions from this project, our leakage displacement, and finally our buffer. So now that we filled everything out, you're going to see that this OK button turns blue. So all your required fields are filled. We're going to select OK. And now we see status says waiting to be added. So this is a part of the workflow where the standard registry has to add this project to the project pipeline. So now we're moving into this project pipeline tab. And we see an add button here. So Gold Standard can view this document, see all the information that we just filled out that included the project details, the project scenario emissions, baseline emissions, all our reductions. And then they can add that to the project pipeline. So now we'd go back to our project proponent. And our project proponent has to assign a VBB. So under assign, you can select there and select your VBB. Now we're going to move into the VBB. And under the projects tab, the VBB now can click view document, and they'll also see all the information that the standard registry just saw, which was our project details, baseline, scenario emissions and reductions, project emissions and reductions. And once they verify all that information, they can select validate. And we're going to go back to Gold Standard. This is an additional step in the Gold Standard workflow where they also verify and validate this information, just like the VBB did. And they can select approve. Once we've done that, we can go to the Technical Advisory Committee. They have a feature where they can comment. So they can view this document here in the VC file and see all the project information. And they can submit a comment. Going to the NGO supporters, they're also going to have that same feature where they're able to comment after they review the document. And now we can go back to our project proponent. And this is when they would complete a report. So you would update all your fields that need to be updated based on the monitoring plan. This would be done at the end of the monitoring period. And once you've updated all that information, for this demo, we're going to keep it the same. You'd also have to update your map. And then you can select OK. So now that the report has been filled out, we can go back to our VVB and select monitoring report. The VVB has to verify this monitoring report at the end of the monitoring period. So they would look at all your updated information in the CC file, verify it. If everything looks good, then they can select verify. And now we see that the status says verified. We can go back to Gold Standard now, and Gold Standard also has to verify all this information, which is also an additional workflow block that doesn't exist in the Verra workflow. So once they verify all this information in the DC file, they can select approve. Now we see we have our Mint button available. The Technical Advisory Committee can also log in and submit a comment on that monitoring report. And going to the NGO supporters, they can also submit a comment into the monitoring report. So we see we have a project pipeline. This is where they would submit a comment for the actual project scenario. And then we have our monitoring report. So this is where they can submit a comment for that monitoring report. So now let's go back to the standard registry where they can now mint. We're going to select that. And now if we go to token history, we see that they minted one token. So now going to the really important part of the Guardian, which is our trust chain. This is where you're going to have all the information associated with that token, who created that token, their verified signature, what policy is it for, the version, so we were in a dry run. And then you're going to see all of that here from the very beginning of our workflow of when we created an account, when we created our policy, who did that, the VC file associated with it. The project was created by our project proponent, which was user one. And we keep going down and we see every single step that we took in this workflow, who took that step. So were we the VVB, were we the project proponent, were we the standard registry? All the information that has to do with it. So even the automatic completion of the monitoring report field, that's going to show here. So now we're seeing when we filled this out, we only really had our stem volume and our dry biomass, but now we're seeing all those auto-calculated fields here. And then we can go all the way down to when we minted our token. And this makes everything easily audible, so it can all be checked, you know, who did what and what information was submitted. Try our Verra policy. And as you can see, we're in dry run here. So for Verra, we should have our standard registry. And then we're going to have our project proponent and our VVB. So we want to create two roles here. Project proponent. And the VVB. And now we see waiting for approval, so we'll go back to the standard registry. They can view that document and hit approve. And then we could go back to the project proponent and fill out that information that would be in your schemas. So again, we're just using demo values. You'd include your map. And you could start putting those values that you would have within your schema for your project. We have our nitrogen fertilizer, which was one of the schemas in the Verra methodology. This one is where you can update that every year. All right, now we can click OK. And now it says status waiting to be added. This is when the standard registry would have to go in and add this project to the project pipeline. Now we could go back to our project proponent and assign the VBB. And now the VBB has access to these documents. They can verify it under the Projects tab and select Validate or Reject. So they have their VC file here with all the information that was input. They'd hit Validate. And now we go back to the project proponent and we can add a monitoring report. So for this demo, we're going to keep all the values the same and scroll to the very end where we'll be able to add an updated map. We could click OK. Under Verra's workflow, the VBB will now have to go back in, go under monitoring report, and view all the new information that was input. And they can verify or reject. And now we could go back to the registry, go under monitoring report, and we see the mint token button. So we could click mint. We see the status is minted now. We go to token history, and we're seeing an amount of 41 tokens were minted for that project. And now we have our trust chain. So here we have all the information associated with this project and the token. You have your verified signature, the policy's name, our version that was in dry run, and we have the trust chain down here. So this is every single step that we had to take with the VC files included to verify that all of the information's there. It went to the right party, which is our role. And it would be from the very beginning of that workflow till the very end. Make sure that everything is audible. All right, thank you everyone for joining. We will be having another webinar next month towards the end of the month. It's always that final week. All that information will be sent out through email if you've joined before. Thank you.